For 3 decades, Owen lived with the ghost of his older brother, a free-spirited photographer named Julian who disappeared on a cross-country road trip in 1988. The case went cold, leaving only a final, faded postcard from Utah as a clue. Now, a call from the San Juan County Sheriff's Office changes everything. Julian's vintage Bronco has been found, half buried in a remote canyon, its interior overflowing with thousands of raven feathers. The bizarre scene looks like a ritual, but Owen feels a cold certainty it's a message meant to hide a much darker truth. What really happened to Julian out in that desert, and what kind of darkness would compel someone to create such a strange and haunting memorial? Stick with me as we unravel a mystery that lay buried for over 30 years. Owen traced the rim of his coffee mug, the ceramic cool against his fingertips. Outside his workshop window, the Oregon rain fell in a steady, familiar rhythm, a sound that had been the backdrop to his life for as long as he could remember. He was a man of quiet routines, of sawdust and wood grain, of shaping raw timber into something solid and dependable. It was a life he had built in direct opposition to his brother's. Julian had been all motion and light, chasing horizons with a camera in his hand, his laughter echoing in rooms he had long since departed. For Owen, Julian wasn't a memory. He was a constant, low hum of absence, a question mark branded onto his soul since he was 20 years old, 35 years, a lifetime. The grief had long ago softened from a sharp, stabbing pain into a dull, persistent ache in his chest. In a worn wooden box on his bookshelf, he kept the artifacts of Julian's last journey, a few letters, a worn map with a red line snaking across the country, and the final postcard. It showed a picture of a red rock arch against a brilliant blue sky. The message on the back was pure Julian. Owen, you wouldn't believe this light. It's like the world is on fire. See you in a few weeks. Don't get too boring without me, Jay. It was postmarked from a small town in Utah. A few weeks had turned into 35 years of silence. The phone buzzed on his workbench, a jarring intrusion into the morning's quiet. He wiped his hands on his jeans and answered, expecting a client or a wrong number. The voice on the other end was female, professional, and hesitant. Am I speaking with Mr. Owen Whitaker? This is he, Owen said. Mr. Whitaker, my name is Deputy Eliza Vance with the San Juan County Sheriff's Office in Utah. I'm calling about a cold case file concerning a Mr. Julian Whitaker reported missing in 1988. Owen's breath caught in his throat. He sat down heavily on a nearby stool. Yes, he was my brother. Sir, a couple of hikers went off trail yesterday in a remote part of the county near Hartstraw Canyon. They found a vehicle partially buried by decades of sand and erosion. She paused, and Owen could hear the rustle of papers. The vehicle is a 1986 Ford Bronco, tan color. The license plate matches the one registered to your brother. Owen closed his eyes. The Bronco. Julian had loved that truck. He'd spent a whole summer working 2 jobs to buy it. Was he inside? The question came out as a whisper. No, sir, there were no human remains found in or around the vehicle. But, Mr. Whitaker, the circumstances of the discovery are highly unusual. Owen waited, his heart pounding a slow, heavy drumbeat against his ribs. The interior of the truck, Deputy Vance said, her voice carefully neutral, was completely full of feathers, black feathers, mostly from ravens, we think. Thousands of them. It's like someone packed the entire cabin with them. Feathers. The word didn't make sense. It was a detail so strange, so out of place, that it felt like something from a dream. Owen stood up and walked to the window, watching the rain. A ritual, a prank, a message. His mind reeled, but beneath the confusion, a new feeling began to surface. Something he hadn't felt in decades. It wasn't hope. Not exactly. It was something sharper. It was purpose. The quiet woodworking man in rainy Oregon had just been given a trail to follow, a trail that led back 35 years into the blazing sun of the Utah desert. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he had to go. He had to see it for himself. He had to understand what that bizarre, feathered tomb was trying to say. The flight to Salt Lake City and the long drive south to the small town of Monticello felt unreal. The landscape transformed from the lush greens of the Pacific Northwest to the stark, stunning reds and browns of the desert. It was beautiful and intimidating, a land that felt ancient and indifferent to human concerns. It was the kind of place Julian would have loved. Owen checked into a small motel and called the number Deputy Vance had given him. She met him at the sheriff's station, a low brick building that seemed to bake in the afternoon sun. She was younger than he'd expected, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a calm, reassuring presence. She led him into a small office and laid a file on the table between them. "I want to prepare you, Mr. Whitaker. The photos are jarring," she said gently. She opened the file. The first few photos were of the Bronco as it was found, its tan paint faded and peeling, its tires sunk deep into the red sand. It was nestled at the bottom of a dry, rocky wash, looking like a forgotten relic. Then she turned the page. The next photo was taken with the driver's side door open. A black cascade of feathers spilled out onto the sand, a river of darkness pouring from the truck's interior. More photos showed the inside, packed so tightly with feathers that you couldn't see the seats or the dashboard. It was a sight so profoundly strange, it defied explanation. It looked like a surreal art installation, a strange and terrible sculpture. "It feels like a statement," Owen said, his voice hoarse, "like someone wanted it to be found this way." "That's what we think too," Deputy Vance agreed. "It doesn't look like a random act. It feels deliberate. We've logged every feather as evidence, but frankly, we don't know what we're looking for." "Can I see the truck?" Owen asked. She drove him to the county impound lot, a dusty yard surrounded by a chain-link fence. The Bronco sat under a tarp. When the attendant pulled it back, Owen felt a wave of emotion so strong it almost buckled his knees. It was Julian's truck. He could see the small dent on the rear bumper where he'd accidentally backed into a post at their childhood home. He ran his hand over the faded paint, half expecting to feel the warmth of the sun from a day in 1988. The interior had been emptied by the forensics team, but a few stray black feathers still clung to the worn upholstery. "My brother was a good carpenter," Owen said, more to himself than to the deputy. He ran his hands under the passenger seat, feeling for the familiar unevenness of the floor panel. He found the small, almost invisible latch Julian had shown him once. He lifted the panel, revealing a shallow, hidden compartment. Julian had called it his secret stash spot. It was empty. "He built that to hide his camera equipment," Owen explained. "If he was in trouble, or if he had something important, he would have put it in there." "So whatever he might have been hiding is gone," Vance concluded. "Or he never got the chance to hide it," Owen said, a new coldness seeping into him. Back at the station, Deputy Vance slid the original 1988 case file across the table. It was thin. A few witness statements from a gas station attendant who remembered Julian, a timeline of his postcard, and then nothing. The trail went cold. "The detective on this case originally," Vance said, tapping a name on the front of the file, "was Marcus Thorne. He retired about 15 years ago, but he still lives just outside of town. He was known for being thorough. If there was anything to find back then, he would have looked for it. Maybe you should talk to him. Sometimes a fresh perspective on old memories can shake something loose." Finding Marcus Thorne's house was an adventure in itself, a small ranch set against a backdrop of distant mesas. Thorne was in his late 70s with a face as weathered as the landscape and eyes that missed nothing. He was hesitant at first, the sudden reappearance of a ghost from his past an unwelcome disruption. But as Owen explained the discovery of the Bronco, and especially the feathers, Thorne's demeanor shifted. He leaned forward, the old spark of a detective reignited. "Feathers," Thorne said, shaking his head. "That's new. Back then, it was like the kid just evaporated. One minute he's buying gas and a soda. The next, he's gone. No sign of a struggle. No leads. Nothing." He invited Owen inside, and they sat in a cluttered study filled with books on local history and geology. Thorne pulled out a dusty box filled with his own unofficial notes on the case. I was always bothered by this one, Thorne admitted, sifting through yellowed notepads. It felt wrong. This area, it keeps its secrets, but not usually like this. Julian passed through town, headed north, supposedly towards Arches National Park. The place his Bronco was found is south of here. It's in the opposite direction of where he was going. So he turned back for some reason, Owen said. Or he never intended to go to Arches in the first place, Thorne countered. He told the gas station attendant he was a photographer, here to shoot the landscapes. That area around Hartstraw, it's rugged, but it's not a tourist spot, it's Dalton country. Dalton? Owen asked. The Dalton family, Thorne explained, his voice lowering slightly. They've run the mining operations in this county for 3 generations. Uranium, mostly. Back in the 80s, they were still a powerhouse. They owned the land, the jobs, they owned the town. Old man Silas Dalton ran things with an iron fist. A memory clicked in Owen's mind, the hidden compartment. Julian was more than a landscape photographer. He did freelance work, investigative stuff. He believed a picture could change the world. Thorne looked at Owen, a grim understanding dawning on his face. If your brother was taking pictures of something the Daltons didn't want seen, that's a problem. They had a reputation. Rumors about cutting corners, safety violations, questionable environmental practices, but nothing ever stuck. People were too scared to talk. The air in the room grew heavy. This was no longer just a missing person case. It was something more. Something dangerous. The problem, Thorne said, leaning back in his chair, is that we have no proof. Just a 35-year-old hunch and a truck full of feathers. What about his camera? Owen asked. It wasn't in the truck. If we find that camera, we find what he saw, Thorne said. But where do we even start looking? Owen's mind went back to the old file. There has to be something someone missed. They spent the next day at the town library, digging through the microfilm archives of the local newspaper, the San Juan Record. They scrolled through weeks of local news from the fall of 1988, looking for anything out of the ordinary. It was a tedious, eye-straining process. Then Owen stopped. Marcus, look at this. It was a small article buried in the back pages dated 3 weeks after Julian was last seen. The headline read, Local Reporter Questions Mine Safety. The article, written by a journalist named David Petrocelli, raised concerns about potential water contamination from a tailings pond at one of the Dalton-owned uranium mines, a mine located just a few miles from Hartstraw Canyon. I remember Petrocelli, Thorne said softly. Ambitious kid. Ruffled a lot of feathers. Owen felt a chill run down his spine. He scanned the archives for the following weeks, searching for David Petrocelli's byline. He found it on a few more articles, none of them about the mine. Then, in late November 1988, he found what he was unconsciously looking for. A small, formal obituary. David Petrocelli, aged 28, had died in a single-car accident on a mountain road. The official cause was brake failure. Brake failure, Thorne repeated, his voice laced with cynicism. He got too close. And if he was a reporter writing a story, he would need a source, Owen finished, the pieces clicking into place with horrifying clarity. A witness. Maybe a witness with a camera. Julian hadn't just stumbled into something. He was part of the story. He wasn't just a victim. He was the evidence. The feathers in the Bronco suddenly felt less like a random ritual and more like a deliberate, symbolic act. A way to silence a story, to bury the truth under a shroud of the bizarre and the unexplainable. Thorne knew that digging into the Daltons was like poking a hornet's nest, but now they had a thread. A dead reporter and a missing photographer, both circling the same toxic secret. David Petrocelli had a family, Thorne said, his mind already working. A wife and a little girl. His wife moved away after the accident, but I think the daughter might still be around. If her father was working on something big, he might have left his notes behind. Finding her wasn't difficult in a town this small. Her name was Clara, and she worked as a librarian at the very library they were sitting in. She was a quiet woman in her early 40s with her father's watchful eyes. When Thorne introduced himself and Owen and gently explained what they were looking for, a guarded look came over her face. The town had long memories, and the shadow of the Dalton family was a long one. "My father's death was an accident," she said, her voice flat, as if reciting a line she'd been taught to believe. "We think he was working on a story that put him in danger," Owen pressed gently. "A story about the Dalton mine. We believe my brother might have been helping him." Clara looked from Owen's earnest face to Thorne's steady gaze. She hesitated, chewing on her lower lip. The fear was still there, even after all these years. But there was something else, too, a flicker of her father's journalistic curiosity. "Wait here," she said finally. She returned a few minutes later with a small, dusty cardboard box. "My mom packed this up after he died. His office stuff. I've never opened it." They took the box to a back table. Inside were old notebooks, press passes, and stacks of files. Owen's hands trembled slightly as he sorted through them. In a folder labeled Dalton Mine, he found what they were looking for. Pages of handwritten notes, interviews with anonymous sources, and photocopied documents detailing safety violations. And tucked in the back was a hand-drawn map of the area around the mine. Petrocelli had marked several locations with an X. One X was right over Hartstraw Canyon, with a note beside it, V.D. Bronco, photographer. Another X was a few miles away, over a small isolated structure, labeled simply, Prospector's Cabin. Proof. "This is it," Thorne breathed. "This is where Julian was hiding the evidence." The map was old, but the landmarks were clear. They thanked a visibly shaken Clara and left the library, the map feeling like a sacred text in Owen's hands. The cabin was their final destination. It was where the truth, or what was left of it, had been waiting for 35 years. They drove out of town as the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and purple. The road turned to dirt, and Thorne's truck bumped along the rutted path. Using the map, they found the turnoff, a barely visible track overgrown with sagebrush. The cabin stood in a small clearing, a derelict structure of weathered gray wood, its roof sagging, its windows long since broken. It looked like it could collapse in the next strong wind. Owen's heart hammered against his ribs as they pushed open the creaking door. The inside was a single room, filled with dust, cobwebs, and the debris of forgotten decades. A rusty bed frame stood in one corner, a collapsed table in the other. "The floor," Owen said, his eyes scanning the wooden planks. He started tapping them with his foot, listening for a hollow sound. Near the old stone fireplace, one of the boards gave a different, deeper echo. He knelt down and pried at the edge with his pocket knife. The wood groaned in protest, then lifted. Beneath it, nestled in the dirt and darkness, was a metal box, rusted but intact. With a grunt of effort, Owen lifted it out. It was an old military-style ammo can. He worked at the latch, which was stiff with rust. Finally, it popped open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was Julian's old 35mm camera, and beside it 6 rolls of undeveloped film. A wave of triumph and sorrow washed over Owen. He had found it. He had found his brother's last message. As they stepped back out of the cabin, the last rays of sunlight disappearing behind the mesas, 2 sets of headlights cut through the twilight, speeding up the track towards them. A heavy-duty pickup truck and an SUV pulled up, blocking their path. The doors opened, and 3 men got out. One was older, with a hard, unforgiving face that Owen recognized from old newspaper photos. Silas Dalton's son, Henry. The other 2 were younger, bigger, and they moved with a confident menace. "That's private property you're on," Henry Dalton said, his voice a low gravel. "And I think you have something that belongs to my family." He nodded towards the ammo can in Owen's hands. There was no loud shouting, no immediate violence. It was worse. It was a cold, quiet threat, an assertion of power that had ruled this valley for generations. Thorne stepped slightly in front of Owen, his hand instinctively moving to his side, where a service weapon would have been 30 years ago. "It's over, Henry," Thorne said, his voice steady. "The truth doesn't stay buried forever." Henry chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "In this country, Mr. Thorne, it stays buried as long as you have a deep enough hole." One of the younger men took a step forward. Owen braced himself, clutching the metal box to his chest. This was it. This was the dark, violent secret the desert had held for 35 years. Just as the tension reached its breaking point, a siren cut through the silent evening air. The piercing sound echoed off the canyon walls. Red and blue lights flashed through the trees. Deputy Vance's vehicle came into view, followed by 2 more patrol cars. She stepped out, weapon drawn. "Henry Dalton, put your hands where I can see them," she commanded, her voice ringing with authority. Thorne had made a call before they left the library, a quiet precaution that had just saved their lives. The Daltons were arrested, their reign of intimidation finally broken. At the station, under the harsh fluorescent lights, the confession came. It was a low-level worker from back then, a man now old and sick and burdened by guilt, who finally told the story. Julian had captured everything on film: the illegal dumping of toxic barrels into the mine shaft at night, the faces of the men doing it, the license plates of the trucks. He'd contacted David Petrocelli, offering the photos as proof, but someone talked. The Daltons found out. They cornered Julian, demanding the film. He refused. They killed him there in the desert and buried his body in an unmarked grave deep within their property. But they were panicked. They knew a missing tourist would trigger a search. Silas Dalton, a man fascinated with local Native American lore, came up with the idea for the feathers. He saw it as a piece of psychological warfare. He thought the raven feathers, a symbol of bad omens and dark magic in some traditions, would create a bizarre mystery. He hoped that if the truck was ever found, the authorities would be so distracted by the strange, ritualistic scene that they would never look for a simple, ugly motive like murder. They would chase ghosts and legends, not land deeds and mining permits. The developed film was everything Julian had promised it would be. Sharp, undeniable proof of the Daltons' crimes, captured in stark black and white. It was his final powerful testament. A few weeks later, following the confession, authorities recovered Julian's remains from the mine property. Owen didn't attend the trial. He didn't need to see the Daltons in a courtroom. He had already faced their legacy in a dark cabin and seen the truth in his brother's photographs. Instead, he drove back out to Hartstraw Canyon, to a high overlook that gazed out upon the vast, silent landscape. He held a small, simple urn. With him were Marcus Thorne and Eliza Vance, the 2 people who had helped him reclaim his brother's story. He said a few quiet words, not of anger or sorrow, but of pride. He spoke of Julian's courage, of his belief that a single image could hold the truth. Then he opened the urn and let the wind carry his brother's ashes out over the red rocks and the deep shadows of the canyon. He was finally home, a part of the light he had chased his whole life. Later, Owen framed one of Julian's last photos. It wasn't of the toxic barrels or the guilty men. It was a simple, breathtaking shot of the sunrise over the mesas, the light catching the edges of the cliffs, making it look, as Julian had written on that final postcard, like the world was on fire. The mystery was solved. Justice, in its slow, grinding way, would be served. But for Owen, the peace came from something simpler. His brother was no longer a ghost. His story was no longer a question. It was an answer. If you were Owen, could you forgive the town that kept a secret for so long out of fear, or would you hold them accountable for their silence? It's a tough question, and I'm curious to hear what you think in the comments below. If you found this story compelling, please consider liking and subscribing. It helps us continue to bring these forgotten stories back into the light. Thank you for listening.